Welcome to the shop. Now we begin the fall session of the Year of Living Manly. It's been an entire summer that I haven't been in touch. The main reason is I've been having too much fun. Spent too much time with my family, as if you could do such a thing, and have been traveling now for work pretty solidly for a month, which I'm personally grateful to be able to do that again. I enjoy that quite a bit, and I've been meeting with clients in all around the country and all around the world. What I have to report is that even though I haven't shown up on a video recently, I have been doing some work. As I said at the beginning of the year, I was going to push myself to explore some of the aspects of masculinity that other people consider stereotypical. In particular, I mentioned things like guns, and I talked about boxing. I haven't gotten to the boxing part, and I may never. The year is running to a close, and I'm kind of eager to get on my next project for 2023. But the gun thing I've been working on, and I won't show it to you, but just yesterday I picked up something that is necessary to my next stage of exploration. And that something is my Massachusetts license to carry. Now, in case any of my neighbors end up watching this, I don't actually own a gun, and I'm not sure I plan to. At least right now I don't have any plans to. Well, okay, that's not fair. I technically own a, can I put it in quotes, gun? I'm going to show it to you here in just a moment. This is the whole reason I got my license to carry, but the license to carry does open up some other possibilities. So I'm going to share with you some of my thoughts about license to carry, my application process, which I began in the middle of the summer and was told appropriately by my police department in my town that it would probably take until October before it was completed, and sure enough, it was. Here I am. But let me first do the unboxing. Here's the box. Let's jump in. Welcome to the narrator voice portion of today's video. But most of today's conversation is going to focus on the process of applying for my license to carry. So stay tuned for more on that in a moment. What you're looking at here is the long land pattern musket that the British invented as part of the British Army, and were able to use roughly some version of this for about 100 years. During the Revolutionary War, the Americans, or what we would have called the colonists back then, or patriots, would have had some version of this. The most common one used at the time was the brown Bess. So it's a slight variation on this, and called brown Bess for reasons that are in dispute. There's no definitive historical explanation of where that nickname comes from. There's a treatment that is applied to the metal of the barrel that makes it brownish. Some people think that's where brown Bess came from. There is also a possible link to Queen Elizabeth. Bess, that one's probably the least likely, in my opinion. The other one, which I think is interesting, is that the Germans also used this. Hessians were, of course, a factor in the Revolutionary War as the British hired them to come fight as mercenaries, and that they may have called it a braun Buss. Brown or strong. The word brown in German is a cognate for the word brawny. In English, you notice they sound the same, but we never confuse them because we spell them differently, but you could do so in Old German. So braun would mean also brown, but would also mean brawny, so strong, in Old German, not really today, as I understand it. Buss is what they would call the weapon. Blunderbuss is an English word that we use for an old musket type with the sort of the bell on the front that helps the ball try to go out in some sort of semblance of a general straight direction. This brown Bess replica, not an original. Those of you who have been following me a little bit this summer saw my series on the men of freedom, men who fought here in the colonies. I live in Boston, and it's just rife with amazing history of men and women who did so much to cause this historical event and to create the possibility for what we have today, which is an America ruled by a constitution, and an America that's not super happy with itself most of the time. And I think that's part of it. Go back and read your Federalist Papers to understand more about that. But anyway, all of this just got me thinking. I'm so fascinated with the weapons. You may be aware that historical reenactments are a thing. People can participate here in historical reenactments, but fascinatingly enough, you can only participate if you have clothing and weaponry that is a match for period-specific weapons and clothing. You have to use the right dyes, you have to use the right materials, they have to be sewn in the correct way, although you can use a machine to do that. It's fascinating stuff. I fully intend to get some of that equipment ready. Up here, the National Park Service they don't sponsor, but they host, they allow private entities to come in and offer classes on how to make a knapsack and how to make a period appropriate overcoat and those kinds of things. They don't have sessions on how to have rifles, but they do have entire instructions on what rifles are allowed and of course how they can be used during reenactments, meaning you cannot aim and fire them. You will be removed, your weapon will be confiscated. Interesting note, it's because the road to Concord from Lexington, where so much of what we talked about in the prior videos occurred, all of that is a national park land, which means it's federal land, which means federal firearms regulations apply. Oh my goodness, I'm going to be so far ahead of myself on this conversation. But my whole point in this was I got fascinated with the question of what is it like to fire a musket? Because this is Massachusetts and because we don't really do parades super well here, I'm going to be honest, but our little town parade does usually feature some Minutemen from different towns in the area where they have reenactors that come and fire, as you just saw. So I caught that scene this summer knowing for sure that I was going to want to use that as my excuse for why I had to learn how to load and fire a brown Bess replica, which I then had to search far and wide to find one. I could not find a finished one that I could afford. I could find a kit, however. So you see the unstained wood, you see the flint locking mechanism, including the flint they provide nicely enough, and there's a steel pan here that creates the spark. I will do videos on all of that later as I get that done, but what I first have to do is finish the preparation of this wood and make sure that it is ready to be used, and then I'll have to learn how to fire it. I'll share all of that with you for the video. Now, the interesting thing is that in order to own this weapon in the state of Massachusetts, you can just buy it. You can buy a used real one, period one, which costs incredible amounts of money, or another replica that someone has already finished, also for pretty expensive and beautiful. Some of those are real works of art. You can own one just fine in the state of Massachusetts, which I think is kind of appropriate. I mean, it is a firearm. It's not a very accurate one. It takes, probably will take me a minute to load when I'm first starting. It takes an average person who's good at it 20 to 30 seconds to load. I mentioned before in a prior video that the British soldiers were drilled on this every day. And as a result, they could do it in as as 10 seconds, which means they could fire 6 times a minute. So 10 seconds, including the time to aim and fire, and then repack the whole thing. So get the ball, we have the powder in, which you have to do on this side. It's a front-loading musket. That's the whole point of it. So you've got to get the powder down, you've got to get the ball in, you've got to tamp it down. Here's what this is for, this guy here. And then once that's ready, you have to prepare to aim and fire and hope that you have enough powder in here that when your flint hits the steel, it sparks the powder, causing the explosion, which then goes inside a little hole here and ignites the powder that's in the barrel, shoots the ball out the barrel. That's this weapon. Now, you can own this weapon just fine in the state of Massachusetts without a license to carry, which, as I was about to say, I think is appropriate because Massachusetts muskets started the Revolutionary War, so making them illegal feels a little wrong. And in all the debates that people have about weapons, you often hear anti-gun people, and I am going to just describe people as anti-gun and pro-gun. I know that sometimes people want to use euphemisms for that. You're anti-gun or you're pro-gun. The people who are anti-gun are very likely to say things like, well, sure, what they meant when they said you could have a right to bear arms was you could have a right to have a musket. Sure enough, I have a musket, and I have a right to own it in the state of Massachusetts. I haven't checked whether other states have similar rules about that kind of thing, but I do think it's kind of nice. Now, I cannot, however, buy black powder. I can own it. I mean, someone could give it to me and I could have it. And so therefore I could technically fire the weapon. But I could not buy black powder without a license to carry. So what I did was I went down and I got one. So part of this video is going to be talking about me preparing this musket, historical musket, a recreation of a historical musket. But also part of this video is going to be me talking about getting a license to carry. and learning what that process was like at a time when the debate over guns, of course, is appropriately difficult for a lot of people. I am going to tell you, I have a Massachusetts license to carry. I just picked it up yesterday after a several month-long process of me trying to figure out what are the requirements for getting that license to carry. I just picked it up yesterday. It's the first week of October. So that several month-long process means I now have the right to go buy a Glock. I could buy and register myself as an owner of any number of weapons that you may have seen. I don't really know much about those weapons because, as will become obvious in this conversation, I'm not a gun guy. I'm not anti-gun, however, but that doesn't necessarily make me pro-gun, and that I'm not out there saying everyone should have one and everyone should, and every gun should be legal. Because of that, I think I'm in a unique position. I'm going to start from this historical period. Start with this piece. I'm going to work on it, and as I work on it here on my little makeshift garage workbench, I'm going to think about what it means to have a gun, what it means to use a gun, and what it means to be prepared to use a gun. Welcome everyone to 2022, a year that will go down in history as a pivotal year in the debate over Second Amendment right to bear arms. I'm going to give you a really quick rundown of what happened this year. The timing is not something I anticipated. When I started this year, I was going to be talking about guns. I was going to try guns to a degree that I never have before. I was thinking about getting a musket, and now I have. But this year became super interesting because one of the things holding me back on applying for a license to carry in the state of Massachusetts is that it is very onerous, and has been in the 23 years I've lived in this wonderful state or Commonwealth. It has been really, really hard to figure out what the rules are for applying for and receiving an unlimited license to carry. And so, this year I thought, I'm going to go through the process. I'm going to do it all. I'm going to document it. I'm going to learn what it's like. And then in the middle of this year, June 23rd to be precise, the Supreme Court, in a 6-3 opinion offered by Justice Thomas, with Alito, Kavanaugh, and Roberts, and Barrett joining or concurring, Breyer, Sotomayor, and Kagan dissented. The Supreme Court basically overturned a whole bunch of state laws that restrict gun ownership, licensing and ownership and use in different states across the United States. So all of this is under the case called New York State Rifle and Pistol Association Incorporated versus Bruen. And this all had to do with a very specific law in New York that essentially, according to those who argued against it, infringed the Second Amendment right. Now, here's the complexity of this. I'm not going to get too deep into because I'm not a lawyer and I don't know that this is what you came here for, but understand that the Second Amendment provides a right to bear arms. The 14th Amendment explicitly forbids a state from restricting a citizen of the United States from the legal rights or protections afforded by the Constitution or the federal government. So the argument before the Supreme Court, which was argued late last year in 2021, and then eventually ruled on this June, was that when a state like New York says, okay, we acknowledge that there is a constitutional right to bear arms, but we're going to encumber that right with a whole bunch of specific restrictions. Now, if you're anti-gun, this totally makes sense to you. You're like, well, yeah, we need to make sure, like we do with cars, that you know how to operate them. We need to put in protections in place so that if you use it inappropriately, you're liable, or whatever the case might be. One of the specific kinds of restrictions that New York was involved in, Massachusetts has been involved in here, was trying to show or require that a citizen, in order to exercise their Second Amendment right, would have to demonstrate a cause, a legitimate cause, and that they would have to have a reason to believe that they need a firearm. So if you think about it, the argument here is pretty simple. The Constitution doesn't actually say the right to bear arms if you think you have a really good reason. But the two-part test, which was a judicial interest balancing test that the courts have been using for many, many years, was that, okay, let's determine whether a law challenges the Second Amendment. And if it doesn't, meaning it still permits gun ownership,
then let's just see whether or not someone who is going to exercise that right has an interest in exercising that right. And I've probably overly summarized that. My apologies. And so states like New York, states like Massachusetts have said you are allowed to have a weapon, sure, but you got to prove to us a couple of things. You got to prove that you know how to use it, and you have to prove that you have a reason to use it. And that can mean something like, in Massachusetts, the terminology is special need, in quotes, to get a license and then to use your firearm. And now what that means is very interesting. And I've been aware of this for a long time. What that means in Massachusetts is that even if you get a license to carry, you may only be allowed to carry it in those circumstances for which you have a special need. So if one of your special needs is I'm a small business owner and I have to take deposits to the bank and I'm worried that someone will try to rip me off. This is actually a common reasoning that people have given in the past. And then all of a sudden you have a weapon with you and it's not en route from work to the bank or bank back to work to carry deposits or other important financial material. Well, you could actually be found in violation of your gun ownership. Your license to carry was only authorized by your town to do that thing. The upshot of that is that in Massachusetts, you have essentially the right to bear arms, but the restrictions that the state has placed, and then each town can place additionally. So you have to go and have an interview, for example, maybe with your sheriff or the chief of police, and that person can decide whether or not your reason for having one is good enough. And there was actually a space, I'll get into the detail of the actual application process later, but there was a space on the application, still is, you can leave it blank now, where you have to explain why you think you need one. And then you have to go and orally defend that. And that has meant, think of it this way, if we remove guns, period, and just say, look, the federal government grants you a right as a citizen, then your state says, okay, you can have that right, but we're going to encumber that right a little bit. And then your town says, and we're going to interpret it different from the town, 5 miles that way or 10 miles that way. You could see why legally that's a problem waiting to be challenged in court, and that is exactly what has been challenged in court. And it's caused the Supreme Court to really reverse an incredible number of the laws that have been passed for gun control in the United States. And the states are reeling right now trying to figure it out. In Massachusetts, for example, the city of Boston had to send notices to everyone that had restricted licenses to carry and say, your license is no longer restricted because we're not allowed to do so by the new Supreme Court law. So we'll see where all this goes. I'm not going to get too much deeper into the Supreme Court part, but I am going to talk in the part 2 of this video about my own application process and what I learned from it. So stay tuned for that in part 2.